Queen Cleopatra. We all knew it's gonna be bad after Netflix released the trailer. The main question was, how bad? Well, they don't insist that the Earth is flat and they don't show flying saucers. So yeah, it could have been worse. I should probably start with saying that I kind of study classical antiquity and I actually know a thing or two about this period. I read primary sources and I terrorize random people with long speeches about ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So, my criticism of this Queen Cleopatra miniseries will be mostly dedicated to pointing out the most outrageous inaccuracies. But not all of them, because otherwise, we're gonna spend here at least a couple of hours, or probably more. I was taking notes while watching the miniseries, and it turned out to be a really painful task in itself. You literally have to pause the video like every 10 seconds. That's the level. It looked like I'm not preparing for the review, but making a stenography. The amount of nonsense and outright lies in this pseudo-documentary is quite sizable. First of all, we should address the elephant in the room. Cleopatra is portrayed by Adele James, a British biracial actress. Yeah, I know they mostly label her as black, because this is how Anglo-Saxon cultures operate. The reason for this questionable casting decision is that the creators of this miniseries, and the list includes Jada Pinkett Smith, well, they obviously have this agenda, the agenda you all are very familiar with. The main list is quite short. Black people and feminism. They try to squeeze sexuality a little bit, but without much success. Even before this miniseries was released, Egyptians started a petition claiming that Netflix essentially tries to falsify history, appropriate the cultural heritage of Egypt, and also of Greek people, by the way, promotes unscientific afrocentrism, and does a lot of other bad things. All of this is pretty much true. The situation is obviously quite different from this trend of blackwashing history when suddenly queens of England are played by black actresses. Because when we're dealing with the work of fiction, one can make an argument about artistic freedom, usually a silly argument, but an argument nonetheless. But the Queen Cleopatra miniseries is marketed as a documentary. You don't really have this creative freedom argument. You can present different theories, because historical studies quite frequently are about theories. People just don't always understand that. But you have to stay reasonable. You can even engage in historical revisionism. This is also another thing that people usually don't understand. They get triggered when they hear historical revisionism. It is not a bad thing. It is mostly a good thing. It is something that moves historical studies forward. You find new data, you analyze the previously acquired information, you reject outdated theories, and work with the new ones. Lots of conclusions and theories about the ancient world we had 2 centuries or 1 century ago, sometimes even a few decades ago, are outdated. And not because somebody's falsifying something. Quite frequently, the exact opposite is true. The scholars are getting rid of falsifications and misinterpretations of facts. The problem is that the creators of Queen Cleopatra don't really engage in revisionism. In proper revisionism, I mean. No, this is not revisionism. This is falsification, and this is a propaganda piece, which conforms with the woke ideology. I don't like to use the word woke too much, because frankly, it has become overused these days. But this is the shortest and easiest way to explain what's going on and why. The previous Netflix docudramas about antiquity didn't exactly do that, only a little bit. And yes, there were other pseudo-documentaries about this period released by Netflix. They just never had that much exposure. First and foremost, I'm talking about 3 seasons of the Roman Empire series. Each season is essentially a different show, The first season was about Julius Caesar, the second was about Gaius Caligula, and the third was about Commodus. All of them were problematic, as you might imagine. The second season even promoted the idea that Gaius Caligula was in incestuous relationships with his sisters, with 3 of them, which is vomit-inducing nonsense. The third season talked a lot about the endeavors of Commodus as a gladiator, and gladiatorial combat was obviously anti-historical. Well, although it must be noted that there are no realistic depictions of gladiatorial combat in films. Literally 0. Queen Cleopatra, as expected, follows the blueprint of the Roman Empire miniseries. The delivery and the structure are absolutely the same. It is marketed as a different series, but it is in fact just a season 4 of the Roman Empire. So, what are the most outrageous aspects of Queen Cleopatra and how do they justify their exotic choices? Let's start with the justification of Black Cleopatra. There's gotta be some justification for this decision, right? Okay, the Professor Shelley P. Haley from Hamilton College immediately informs us that her grandmother told her, "I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black." You've heard this phrase in the trailer. That's horrible on many levels. They continue with phrases like, I'm gonna bombard you with some quotes right now. We don't know her exact racial heritage. We don't know who Cleopatra's mother was. It's possible that her mother was an Egyptian. Ancient Egyptians would have had a variety of different complexions, as we find in other African cultures today. Skin color ranged from black to pale brown. Given that Cleopatra represents herself as an Egyptian, it seems very strange that we insist on depicting her as a wholly European. And my favorite, I want people to know the story of Cleopatra because she was an African queen. And that's a fact that's been buried, it's been erased, it's been whitewashed. Okay, long story short, she wasn't an African queen. She was a Greco-Macedonian queen of Egypt. Nobody ever whitewashed her. People don't whitewash Greeks. That's not a thing. But let's imagine, for the sake of conversation, she was actually an ethnic Egyptian. What would she look like? Well, she'd look like an ethnic Egyptian. It's an insult to Greek people, an insult to Egyptian people, an insult to all of the Europeans and non-Europeans who built their cultures on the foundations laid by the cultures of antiquity, and it is an insult to black people from numerous black nations who get mercilessly tokenized, presented as something that they are not, and bundled wholesale in one category based on the color of their skin. Also, labeling her as an African queen is not accurate. At the end of the series, in the last episode, Augustus literally says to her, I quote, "Your African sorcery failed you this time." Augustus obviously never believed that Cleopatra was a sorceress, and also Egypt wasn't in Africa. This is something that the showrunners ignore completely, or possibly unaware of. The name of the continent was derived from the Roman province of Africa, much, much later. I could go into details on the subject, but let's try to keep it short. So the phrase about African sorcery makes as much sense as arriving in New York and accusing somebody of, I don't know, Canadian witchcraft. Augustus, by the way, is depicted as an evil, stupid, misogynistic buffoon. Cleopatra starts a conversation with him with the phrase, "You are a lot shorter than I thought you'd be." And she delivers it with a condescending smile. She actually comes off as a genuinely arrogant and extremely toxic person in this miniseries. The screenwriters believe that's how powerful female characters act. This is where we come to the second important subject of Queen Cleopatra. I'll give you some quotes again. This is a woman exercising power. There was a time, a long time ago, when women ruled with unparalleled power. They bowed to no man, left footprints so deep that no man could erase them, and so on. You get the gist of it. Feminism, empowerment, men hate strong women, etc. Great. What about Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth II? Let's all make a shining beacon of feminism out of Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia. How do you like that? I don't know what they are trying to say with this long time ago when women ruled with unparalleled power. This is just some made up narrative. They also mentioned that Egypt's women had almost equal rights to men under the law, and women could choose who they married, they chose who they divorced, they could start businesses, they kept their own property. Women in Rome were supposed to stay at home. That's an oversimplification. Also, Ptolemaic Egypt was a divided society. Cleopatra was a part of the Greco-Macedonian nobility. Greek women legally had a male guardian, and so on. We can have a long conversation about all that. The filmmakers are just trying to push their agenda at all costs and to present Romans as some kind of evil imbeciles. The good thing about this women empowerment and strong female character approach is that Cleopatra was indeed a strong female character. This is the way to go. This is a very solid foundation and a very reasonable approach to this character. But since the creators of the show are blinded by their agenda and frequently simply incompetent, most of the time they just can't stick to the narrative and start contradicting themselves. First, she's a practitioner of realpolitik and a Borgia-style politician, which is correct. Then suddenly she says something about abandoning our allies in the time of need. And it goes kinda like this all the time, with numerous other aspects. Like they forgot to edit out some bits in the post-production or something. Like they say, Rome was against the idea of a woman being a ruler. It's that simple. And then begrudgingly acknowledge that, Rome was a republic. And they also didn't like when foreign monarchs get involved in the internal politics of the country and pretty much try to become the rulers of Rome themselves. As you might expect, the political aspect gets dumbed down, which is a thing that people traditionally do when they are working on a product intended for the mass audience. That said, since it is a documentary, you cannot help but expect the authors to be grown-ups and dissect the political aspect as grown-ups, not 10-year-old kids. And yes, the politics of both Rome and Egypt at the time was very complicated and very deceptive. Nobody really knows what was happening behind the scenes, and you can have a number of interesting theories. It is a fantastic material for a proper documentary. Unfortunately, Queen Cleopatra is not a proper documentary. They mention a couple of interesting things where the screenwriters could potentially turn the ship around and turn the miniseries into something valuable, something deep. Like this episode when Octavian accuses Cleopatra of providing financial aid to Brutus and Cassius. Yes, he did that. And it leaves lots of room for speculations about, realpolitik. This is gold. But they don't venture into this direction. Or when they say that, ironically, like Cleopatra before, Octavian is elevated as a living god. They should have elaborated more on the subject. This is also gold. But they don't do any of that. They keep contradicting themselves, keep pushing their obscene agenda at any cost, and they keep saying and showing us more stupid stuff. You want more examples? Okay. Cleopatra is the last pharaoh of Egypt. No, she's not. Egypt's long history as a great civilization ends. Not really. Rome impoverished Egypt. Very debatable. Mark Antony is essentially a commoner who's risen through the ranks. Yeah, his grandfather was a consul, one hell of a commoner. Rome at this stage is the most powerful of the empires. The wording of this phrase is simply bizarre. And it just goes on and on and on. Characters are dressed in strange clothes. Black people are everywhere at the court in Alexandria, and Alexandria itself is usually shown as some kind of a rundown Middle Eastern fort. Cleopatra literally says stuff like, "I'm a god, do not disrespect me," which is an impossible phrase in a conversation with a non-Egyptian. Caesarion's official name is never mentioned. The screenwriters honestly think that it was really his name. I told you, we can do this for a couple of hours. It's bad. It's really bad. So, what have we learned from Cleopatra? Ancient Greeks were black. Egyptians were also black. Augustus was an evil dwarf. People hated Cleopatra for being a woman. Cleopatra was in full control of her sexuality and identity, whatever it means. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh, all other pharaohs don't count, not even her son. Your grandmother is a reliable primary source on classical antiquity. Historians take instructions from visions in their dreams. In the end, this is the new law even compared to the worst bits of pseudo-documentaries on classical antiquity produced by Netflix. You know, the ones where Gaius Caligula sleeps with his sisters. This miniseries attempts to appropriate both ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian cultures, discredits feminism, misinterprets the sources, and twists the facts to a point where it looks like falsification of history. It has quite racist undertones. It is poorly written, and it is poorly performed.